Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail.
When I turned 6 in July of 1973, I was being prepared, just like any child would be, to go to school. I was excited. Granny wanted me to have something new to wear, my cousin and I. So we were brought to town here to Williams Lake, and I remember choosing a shiny orange shirt.
This is residential school survivor Phyllis Webstad.
It had 3 buttons down the front, and it had like a shoelace on the front, and it was like a Nemo orange, a shiny orange.
It was what she wore on her first day of residential school. But as soon as she arrived, it was taken from her.
My shirt was taken, and we were made to have a shower. At home, we didn't have electricity or running water. I'd never had a shower in my life. And all of a sudden, the water's coming out of the walls. And a lot of us are like that, just screaming and not knowing like what is going on. That's where I learned that my life depended on me. And no matter how much we protest, no matter how much we cry, it doesn't matter. We didn't matter, and that's where Every Child Matters comes from.
Phyllis's story inspired a movement in Canada that started back in 2013 called Orange Shirt Day. September 30th was the chosen date because it was around this time that kids were taken from their homes and sent to residential schools. It was a day meant to honor survivors of these schools by wearing orange and revisiting their history. This year, Orange Shirt Day has been turned into a federal statutory holiday. Today, September 30th, is the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Creating this day to commemorate and acknowledge the trauma caused by residential schools was the 80th in a list of 94 recommendations put forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We've heard a lot over the last few years about the road to reconciliation. But aside from a federally recognized day of commemoration, how much progress have we actually made? And how do you measure that? Katherine Starzyk is a psychology professor at the University of Manitoba, and she's the lead on a new project that's trying to answer that question, a reconciliation barometer. Ry Moran is a member of the Red River Metis and the Associate University Librarian-reconciliation at the University of Victoria. He's also a contributor to the Barometer project. They're both on the show today to talk about their efforts and what this day means to them. That's today on the Decibel. Ry, Katherine, thank you so much for being here. It's great to talk to you both.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for having us.
So, Ry, I'll start with you. Today is the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and the establishment of this day is something that was called for by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How do you feel now that it's here?
Yeah, I feel very positive that the day has arrived. You know, when we reflect back on where we started, even as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, myself being one of the staff members there, the future was very uncertain. We really didn't know how many documents we would collect. We certainly didn't know how many statements we would collect. We didn't know whether or not we could mobilize the country to respond to the calls for justice and healing that were sounding so loudly. We had a lot of hope. We brought a lot of hard work to the table, but we didn't know how the country itself would respond. And the fact that we've now achieved this incredible milestone in Canadian history is remarkable. And while there's still a lot more work to go, I think we can absolutely see this as a transformative moment in Canadian society. And most importantly, reflect on the great and profound and ongoing need to recognize and honor residential school survivors, to recognize families, recognize communities, recognize nations that have been affected by this history of genocide, and redouble our efforts to pursue this ongoing path of healing.
We hear this word a lot, but I don't know if I've heard a definition for it. So what is reconciliation?
Well, that is a good question. I mean, I think that's one of the things that this effort that we are going through, as a team, is seeking to kind of tease out. But if we look at what has been supplied to us, First of all, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sort of re-echoed what the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples said on reconciliation. And it said that reconciliation is the establishment and maintenance of mutually respectful relationships. But it strengthens that in a number of different ways by saying that, for example, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the framework for reconciliation, which says that it's not just a matter of getting along better, it's actually a matter of resurging or reconstituting the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples as human beings. Mm-hmm. That definition, too, of the establishment and maintenance is actually deceptively complex, too. And, there's a lot going on in that because it's talking about our past, our present, and our future. And certainly creating space for and valuing Indigenous futures in this country is a huge part of what reconciliation is. And then there's the other part of reconciliation, which is it's very individually specific. So for some individuals, it might mean healing within their family. For other individuals, it might mean healing from, childhood sexual trauma. For others, it might mean conducting specific actions in regards to languages or cultures, there's a whole myriad of things that it means to people. And I think we have to think at once what the Commission has supplied to us and also at the same time, the breadth and diversity of what reconciliation means at the individual level.
So, Katherine, you've been leading the work on something called a reconciliation barometer. Can you describe what this barometer will look like and what it's meant to do?
Sure. So the barometer is a set of survey questions that we're asking Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And it has 13 indicators that speak to different aspects of reconciliation because that concept is such a large one with many pieces to it. So the foundation for those questions is really different and important. And so one of the foundations for those questions are survivor answers to the question, what does reconciliation mean to you? Importantly, the indicators are perceptions of these things. So how do Indigenous and non-Indigenous people perceive, for example, that there are mutually respectful relationships or nation-to-nation relationships or respect for the natural world or systemic inequality? So for us, a large number of our indicators aren't actually about the quality of the relationships, but rather some of these kinds of system inequality things, because they are so very important. And they're more important for people who are experiencing that inequality, right? So for example, if we ask Indigenous people to report whether or not Indigenous people are treated fairly in healthcare, and Indigenous people say not so much, and non-Indigenous people say, yeah, pretty good, then we see that there's some distance that we have to work on. So, part of processes of reconciliation, peace, and just kind of like living well together is having a shared sense of reality, right? Creating the same story together. And so many of our questions kind of speak to that, but for very specific things. So they're not general questions for the most part. They're specific questions.
Yeah.
And of course, like this kind of public polling perception work needs to be complemented by tracking the extent to which we are meeting the calls to action, the extent to which, real inequality and inequities are getting smaller or larger. So we are assessing the perception of reconciliation, but there's other important work to do too, alongside this.
Well, I think, as Katherine has said, this is one tool in a toolkit of understanding where we are and where we're not, right? And I think what is important is that it is really important that we collectively continue to ask ourselves, how are we doing in this effort of reconciliation? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself was quite clear in saying that ongoing monitoring and transparency of data is paramount, and called for the creation of not only a number of statistical reports, but called for a specific mechanism in line with international human rights mechanisms to track a number of key indicators with hard data, with hard evidence supplied by various levels of government. That says to us that we have to stand on guard in many ways. The truth and reconciliation process that we're going through is something that has been given to all Canadians. And ultimately, it's going to be up to all of the country to determine how successful we are with this in many ways. One thing that we have to do, though, and I think what this barometer, again, adds to or contributes to at least, is just a bit of an understanding of where we're at and where we're not at. Mm-hmm. Certainly, from an anecdotal perspective, in my previous role with the National Centre, and even today, one of the most common questions that I get asked is, how are we doing? Right?
Yeah.
I can say, well, there's this that's happening, there's that that's happening. We can point to pieces of legislation, but it's the right question to be asking. And if we're not sort of succeeding on this path of reconciliation, we do have to ask ourselves what needs to change and what do we need to do in order to redouble our efforts so that we don't find ourselves in the same state of affairs 20 years down the road and that we sleepwalk into ongoing human rights violation in this country.
So how are we doing?
Well, how are we doing? Okay, so I don't know, pick a measure basically, right? How are we doing on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation? How many provinces have implemented it? So we have a federal stat. I'm in the province of BC. It's a stat here in BC, but, universities are going to be in session tomorrow in Ontario. The question is what does that mean, right? Mm-hmm. How are we doing on the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Well, okay, again, we have federal legislation. I'm here in BC. We have provincial legislation. We have premiers in the country that are vehemently opposed still to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we have a large percentage we have basically the Conservative Party of Canada still voting more or less as a bloc against that when we look at the voting record just of the last 18 to 24 months. That says that there are many people in this country still very comfortable living in a society that does not endorse, support the most widely debated or extensively debated human rights mechanism in the history of the world. So how are we doing? We have to sort of take a look at these indicators. People like Cindy Blackstock are very, very clear on saying that we are failing generations of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children today. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon's report on systemic discrimination in the healthcare system, which was just released in the province of BC, says that we have a lot of work to do. We've talked about systemic racism and discrimination in the police force. So we're in the midst. We are in a reconciliation process. We still know that we have substantial change that is necessary. And, just this week, Murray Sinclair was saying that this is the work of generations. This is not an easy solution. So that's where that monitoring and careful sort of assessment of where we are and where we're not becomes that much more important, because it's going to take time. As much as, honestly, I wish that we could change things right away, and we need to change things as rapidly as possible, because we are continuing to fail communities to this day.
So just so I'm clear, have you already started surveying people, or are you still developing the tool? Where is the project at right now?
So we've developed the tool, we've finished surveying, and now we're writing up the report and developing the website. So we will be releasing it this fall. And then once we've released it, our goal is to track progress on a yearly basis at first, and if our capacity increases over time, perhaps more frequently.
So, Katherine, there are other countries where we've seen similar tools being used to measure where society's at on the path to reconciliation. Can you give me some examples of where else we've seen this being done?
The closest, in some ways, example is South Africa, because we've spoken the most with them, but Australia as well has an excellent barometer, and those have been around for about 2 decades. One of the interesting things that really suggests that this is very important is that reconciliation in South Africa hasn't always gone steadily upward.
What do you mean by that?
Sometimes things go backwards, relationships get worse, the inequality between people gets bigger, and people start to become more worried about what will happen in the future.
Ry, do you think you could see the results of the survey being used to like hold politicians accountable?
It's a tool in the toolkit. So I think the more data points we have, the more informed a conversation we can have. That's where I think, again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission placed such a heavy emphasis actually on the production of statistical information and the measurement and monitoring of a number of what you might consider key indicators. Key indicators that oftentimes are focused on some of the most problematic or troublesome areas of the gaps that exist between quality of life enjoyed between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, like maternal health, overall health and well-being, incarceration, victimization, many of the things that we've seen in the newspapers for a very long period of time that are kind of commonly understood, but like we have to see those gaps closing. Because if we're not seeing those fundamental gaps closing, what the heck are we doing, right? Mm-hmm. So these are all tools to hold leaders to account, to hold society to account, because ultimately at the end of the day, so much about what our challenge is as a country is not the actions of individuals. Yes, the actions of individuals have been terrible in many regards, but it's also our actions as a collective society. Collectively, we have failed to implement and uphold Indigenous rights. Collectively, we have failed to recognize the inherent legitimacy of Indigenous languages, cultures, histories in these lands. Collectively, we have a massive historical misunderstanding to overcome in this process of decolonization. So yes, it's a tool to hold leaders to account, but we also individually have to hold leaders to account. And we ultimately, like as citizens, are our leaders. Like society is a reflection of the choices that we've made. We've made just very inequitable and unfair choices in this country.
So Ry, on the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, in the wake of the horrific discoveries of unmarked graves at residential school sites that we've been hearing about this year, given that we just had an election, what do you want Canadians to be thinking about?
Well, I think there's a lot to hold within one's heart. And I think that's one of the first maybe places that we need to start is not so much what we're thinking about, but what we're feeling as a society. I hope that we feel both a sense of loss and regret, I think, for the missed opportunities, and a sense of sorrow for the harm inflicted, and a very solemn remembrance for those that have been harmed. And I hope we also feel a sense of resolve and determination that we can do better and we can overcome and that we can get through this and that we can be a country that actually fully embraces human rights and principles of fairness and equality. I hope that people say, we will never forget, and they understand what that means. And then they, in that spirit of resolve, say, never again, never again. And Katherine's already talked about the need to connect the past to the present. We have to recognize that when we say never again, we mean changing what's happening today, because we're still repeating many of the same mistakes of the past. So those are some of the thoughts that I hope. I hope we also hold survivors very, very dear in our hearts, and their families very, very dear in our hearts. They deserve that. They've given this country such an opportunity to even have this conversation that we're having right now. We do collectively owe them a significant debt of gratitude for having the courage and strength for speaking out about the injustices that they have suffered and for breaking the silence on that. That has given us the opportunity to move much more fully into this process of reconciliation that the country has been so much in need of. So the very least we can do and is hold them dear in our hearts and to think about them and to send them our thoughts and our love for continued well-being, and to send that on to their families, communities, nations, children.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much to you both. I really, really appreciate this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Katherine Starzyk and Ry Moran. If you want to find the Reconciliation Barometer on Twitter, they're at Barometer Lab. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.